very good, but the truth is very powerful. And in the last few verses, he says this, the Lord said, you've been concerned about this vine, though you did not tend it or make it grow. It sprang up overnight and died overnight, but Nineveh has more than 120,000 people who cannot tell their right hand from their left, and many cattle as well. Should I not be concerned about that great city? What God is referring to is that Jonah had sat down under a shaded tree, and he's enjoying the rest for the moment, and all of a sudden he sees that plant begin to shrivel up and die, and he wants to die himself because this tree that provided him shade has gone. And God said to him, are you right to be angry about this? It rose overnight and died overnight. The Hebrew is very strong. The English mitigates the force of what is said. The English says, yes, I have a right to be angry. In the Hebrew, it actually says, it has the force of an expletive, quote, damned angry. I'm damned angry. That's a man talking to God with profanity. I have a right to be upset because I had this shade and now it's gone. And so God ends by saying, you had a right to be angry about a shrub that grew up and then died overnight, and you don't care about that city with all these thousands of people who don't know the difference between their right hand and their left, morally speaking? I want to bring you 3 thoughts from this book. Number 1, Jonah was out of touch with his surroundings. Out of touch with his surroundings. You cannot communicate to people if you're out of touch with them. What kind of a world are we living in today? You know, Assange toned down his testimony purposely out of respect for the setting and not wanting to sound crass. The first time I met him, he opened up his heart and told me what went on in his life before that. Hayden Coe is here, a famous actor in the Philippines. His picture is on billboards all over. Names of fragrances bear his name, highly successful. It was in June of this year I met Hayden at a gathering. I know I'm not embarrassing him. He's a man who has the courage to face up to what happened. And I was speaking at a businessman's dinner in Manila when he was the first one to walk up to the microphone, and he says, you know, you're talking about meaning and purpose in life. I'm living with shame and guilt and pain. I have no meaning left. And the tears running down his face. And you know, I looked at him, and I knew he was a made-for-the-movies kind of guy. I didn't know he was in the movies. He's actually a medical doctor, a skincare specialist, went into the movie world, made it big, got his life into a shambles in private, on the path to self-destruction. So also Assange. So also many other young men that I meet, and younger ones, that the world of the internet and the world of pornography and the world of sensuality is destroying in our time. My daughter one day said to me, Dad, my daughter Naomi, who works rescuing men and women from the streets of cities in the sex trafficking industry. She lives with a broken heart for what she witnessed and what it did to men and marriages. And she's pleaded with me to co-author a book on pornography with her. I said, honey, I don't want to get into that world. I don't want to touch that stuff. I don't want to research that stuff. She says, Dad, if you only knew how many women's lives are destroyed because of the way men handle this stuff, and marriages that are shattered and marriages that are broken, you would not fight me so much on this. Please write. She said, you write on the sacredness of sexuality. I'll write on what I've seen happen by the desacralization of it. And what's happened in our time, ladies and gentlemen, 2 things. The entertainment world has forgotten its moral boundaries. They have no boundaries left. The artists want total liberty with no absolutes. And the Lord of the Bible says to us to worship Him in the beauty of holiness. Even beauty must have boundaries. It must be circumscribed by absolutes. Years ago, a famous American journalist by the name of George Will, writing in Newsweek magazine, was commenting on where the entertainment world was going in sensuality and violence. This is dated, but if anything, even worse has happened since then. Here's what he says. Times Square in New York, which is the rotting core of the Big Apple, is home of this city's last growth industry, pornography. This industry has flourished in spite of a naive hope. It represents the failure of a public policy which, like so many liberal policies, was based on nothing more than naive hope. Some aspects of American life have become so vulgar that they can hardly be discussed without contributing to the coarsening of American life. Elbow your way through the dirty men in dirty raincoats and the crowded peep shows, and read for yourself the vivid descriptions of current fare. These are no longer just seedy storefront operations. On 8th Avenue, there's a pornography supermarket, a kind of a supermarket for perverts. It is located in a modern building owned and shared by a major bank. Pornography in this area has achieved new sliminess involving children and animals, and business is booming. And then he goes to the movie world. Until the final minutes, this Latin American film, Snuff, is a mishmash of shootings and knifings and general mayhem. This part is not much worse than what erupts on U.S. television at 9:01 each night after the family hour. But the final minutes of Snuff show a man dismembering and disemboweling a live woman using a knife, wire clippers, and an electric saw. Feminist groups have missed with their wondrous knack the larger point and denounced Snuff as an insult to women. The final murder, whether real or fake, is repulsive enough to convince the dismal viewers who want to believe it is real. When I saw the final butchery, left the viewers tittering merrily, asking one another, it was real, wasn't it? The audience would have been surly if the murder had been unconvincing. Remember a decade ago, the Connecticut woman who went to see I Am Curious Yellow. That Swedish film was a great shocker in the 60s, even though it only showed simulated sexual intercourse. That wasn't enough for the Connecticut woman who indignantly walked out and said, I paid for filth and I didn't get filth. You know, that's the world of movies. I'm not saying it's the whole world of movies. What's happened in the cyber world to your children, my children? What are they being exposed to night after night? How can a 12-year-old handle this kind of an assault on the total decimation of the imagination? Could you handle it as an adult? All that is assaulting them, sprawling in a big mass into their imagination, desacralizing sexuality, desensitized to a woman's need for dignity, honor, respect, protection, care. All of this is gone. And our homes are under attack. And if you get out of the homes, you go into ideologies, violence has taken over. These are the two realities of our times. The desacralization of the body and the desacralization of the right of another person to live. We are living in this kind of world. Are you in touch with it? Are you aware of what it is that's happening? I wish I could tell you how many young men I meet in my travels. One of the reasons these guys travel with me is when they come to me and, you know, I'm busy on the road. I mean it. You understand that? From morning till night, your mind is just thinking of what you've got to speak, what you've got to say, what your primary mission there for. But when young guys like this come around and say, you know, I want to travel with you, I want to go with you, I want some time, I heartily say yes, because I know they are the victims of the enemy of our souls. He has time for them to destroy them. And when they are blessed with good looks and good personalities and enough money in the bank, there's someone out there to exploit and plunder them. Our young men, primarily our young men, are living in danger today of the desacralization of the body, and you and I had better understand what is going on in our world right now. When I grew up as a younger man, I hardly heard the word. I don't think I would have known the word pornography when I was a teenager. I don't think I ever saw one. Never held one. And for the life of me, I don't even know what it is that holds a person, except that I do know it changes the way you think and makes you hunger after a feeling, not necessarily after a person who will not be able to hold them for more than a few moments. They're in search of a feeling. And then violence. We talk about these people somehow being programmed or recalibrated, radicalized. We use new terms as if somehow their will was not engaged in wanting to move in this direction. Those of you in the business world know better than what I'm talking about. You go into a hotel room night after night, this happens. I remember speaking to the Atlanta Braves baseball team once, and I looked at the boys' muscles bulging like watermelons. And I said, it's a terrible feeling to walk into the clubhouse and be the only one who fails the physical. I said, that's who I am. I said, you guys are specimens of athleticism. You guys can hit a ball that I'm not even able to see when it's coming over the plate. I said, so I'm not going to talk to you about how to hit a ball. I said, but I'm going to talk to you about something that I've done probably than most of you, spent my life on the road. And I want to talk to you about how to live your life on the road. I kid you not. The guy's arms dropped, they leaned forward and started to listen. And at the end of it, one of the highest paid players, actually, he was not on the Braves side. This guy was at that time playing for the St. Louis Cardinals. You speak to the two teams. And this guy came over, held my shoulders like this, powerfully built, and he then looked at me, my staff travel assistant standing next to me, and as soon as he heard him talk, out of courtesy, he stepped back. And the tears running down his face, he said, Ravi, I wish I'd heard this message some years ago. He said, I am a multi-million-dollar athlete, but I've lost everything that's of real value in my life. My wife, my children, my family. Why? You sit in a hotel room and that filth comes through. And they sell themselves to these things. They're gone. Now, I don't know what message and ministry God is calling you to, but I just want to say to you this. There's a world of need out there. We all can't meet all of it. But I remember during a huge tragedy in New York City, what happened when a man was, as a city councilman, was asked, how come he didn't know all that was going on in his borough? And he said, I have a hard time sometimes even knowing all that's going on in my home. You're asking me to find out all that's going on in my borough? He said, if you want me to listen to the heart cry of every person in my constituency, and here's what he said, and I quote, you may as well ask me to listen to the sound of every blade of grass growing and the heartbeat of every squirrel. The noise would be deafening on the other side of silence. You may as well ask me to listen to the sound of every blade of grass growing and the heartbeat of every squirrel. The noise would be deafening on the other side of silence. There's a vast scream out there. I'm going to ask you this. What portion of that gigantic scream, all of which can only be heard in one heart, and that is the heart of God, where there's an aggregate of human suffering, what portion of that is He assigning to you? Are you willing to take it? What portion of the world's pain is He going to ask you to carry? Are you willing to carry it? God has called us to Christian apologetics. He's going to call everybody to it. He's called some of you to walk into the streets of Mumbai or Hyderabad or whatever, rescue them. God be with you. Every calling is a noble calling. I'm just asking you this. Are you bearing your burden for what God has called you? Get in touch with your surroundings. Secondly, I want to ask you, have you got in touch with your message? Jonah lost sight of his message. You know what the message of God is? That in His love and in His grace and in His mercy, He reaches out to us in our depths and transforms, forgives, and redeems by sending His Son to the cross. Are you in touch with your message? One of the things I've learned, which is really quite amazing, is this. God has a time and God has a timetable. I believe that very much. I struggled and suffered with my back for 27 years of agony and pain. Those of you who know my story, and so many of you, actually one young man as we walked in tonight, put his hand on my back and said, "How's your back doing?" I had a triple herniation, 2 metal rods from my middle of my back all the way into my tailbone, 8 screws bolting me in with 2 major surgeries that have transpired. Last year, through an incredible experience, a man from Singapore, godly man, came and said God had spoken to him. I don't have the time to go into the story to tell you. But as he laid his hand on my back and prayed, and I'd been prayed for years and years and years, it was an incredible thing. Maybe I'll just give you a snippet of it. He said, God told me 2 things about you yesterday. Number 1, that is anointing in your life, and the years that is going to be greater than the years to come. I said, Dew, are you really speaking from your heart that God said this to you? He said, yes. I said, I would welcome it. He said, but then Ravi, he told me something I have no clue about. He said, tell Ravi, like the Apostle Paul, he'll have a thorn in the flesh, but I'll take care of him. 3, 4, 5. He said, lying in bed there, I said, Lord, I don't know what 3, 4, 5 means. He said, you tell Ravi, he'll know. He said, I'm here to tell you, here in Atlanta, as I'm visiting from Singapore, God wants me to tell you he's going to take care of you 3, 4, 5, and I haven't a clue what that means. I got the tears in my eyes. I said, Dew, from 1985, the pain in my back has been L3-4 and L4-5. I'd get up in the morning and didn't know if I could walk straight. The shooting pain in my back, sometimes I'd sit in my car and just cry. The agony. I don't want to get into medicines because I don't want to foul with my brain, and so I just live in the pain. A few days later, after Dew prayed for me, my travel associate and I were in another city. I got off security, and I sat down on a chair and bent my knee and bent down like this to tie my shoelace. He looked at me and said, what are you doing? I said, Corinne, I wasn't aware of what I'm doing. Because I'll tell you what, prior to that prayer, 29th May last year, if I'd done this and tied my shoelace, I'd be walking in pain for 6 to 7 weeks with anti-inflammatories because it would yank something in my back and I would just be hobbling over just to do this. I couldn't tie my shoelace without kneeling on the floor. I just looked at him and said, this is amazing. Absolutely amazing. I'd already told my wife what had happened on the prayer. Since 29th of May till dreams of home. What do you want to do? David says, I wish I could get a drink of water from my well. 3 of his biggest fighters get behind the enemy ranks, get to that well, fill up a pitcher, come back to him. Ta-da! Want a drink, David? And David is about to pour it, and he says, where do you boys get this from? So David, it's from your well in Bethlehem. So how'd you do it? So we snuck behind enemy lines. You guys put your life in jeopardy? Yes, sir. We admire you. We love you. Want you to have it. David's about to put it to his mouth, takes it down, pours it onto the ground and says, I cannot jeopardize the sacred right of another person to enjoy something for my pleasure. If he had reacted the same way when he saw Bathsheba, all of Old Testament history would have been different. Ladies and gentlemen, especially to you gentlemen, I want to say this. We need to know where our boundaries are, where the lines are that we need to draw. What is sacred? What is fulfilling? And I know whereof I speak. 4 decades on the road and the temptations never diminish. There's always somebody who wants to buy you. There's always somebody who wants you to cross a boundary. And as Chesterton said, whenever you remove any fence, always pause long enough to ask why it was put up there in the first place. Think about that. And so I ask you, are there boundaries you have set up beyond which you will not cross? That's what really makes the leader who can mentor the younger ones so that the younger ones can look up to them and say, that man or that woman is my leader, knew what lines not to cross. I've seen this happen again and again in both directions. You know, most of India's leaders who hosted the Commonwealth Games are in jail today because they were bought. They were bought. In Hindi, they say, Mej ke niche, under the table. It's under the table. It's under the table. When I was in France having dinner with the leader of their business school and head of Carrefour, the CEO, both of these men were completely non-theistic in their thinking. I was hosted by a Chinese businessman who's become a close friend, and my wife sitting next to me. And they asked me, what do you normally speak on? I said, well, sometimes in schools I'll speak on ethics and so on, trying to find some common ground. Do you know what the president of the business school in Paris told me? One of the best in all of Europe. He said, we don't teach ethics in our school. I said, really? So conversation changed. A few minutes later, we were talking about the election coming up in which Hollande was going to win. He said, we had 3 of our graduates running, but they all knocked themselves out. One was an alcoholic, one was a womanizer, and the third was arrested for corruption. And my wife leaned over and said, maybe they should be teaching ethics in their schools. I said, the whole issue, what do you compromise? Now, when I think of a principle like that, not to jeopardize the sacred right of another, as far as I know, I haven't sold my soul to anybody in my travels. I haven't sold my convictions, as far as I know that. But then I look back after 4 decades on the road, and I see my children now grown up and 3 little grandchildren. And I say to myself, boy, they're now adults. The 18 years came and went so soon. Did I sacrifice them as I was about what I thought was a noble profession? Most of our problems that are going on in our cities, because there's not a father or a mother there to give them the values and give them the ethics that helps a young man to be a gentleman and a young woman to grow up to be a young lady, so that they know what virtue is all about and what respect is all about, and the way you speak to people and the way you treat your fellow human being. This stuff has to be done at home. That's how we produce leaders. This stuff has to be done at home. You produce a young man and a young woman who carries with dignity that life. And so, as I leave this with you as my second thought, I just want to look at this thought and close with a final idea. Drs. Minath and Meyer, talking about businessmen, say this: we are convinced that many people choose happiness but still do not obtain it. The reason for this is that even though they choose to be happy, they seek for inner peace and joy in wrong places. They seek for happiness in materialism and do not find it. They seek for joy in sexual prowess but end up with fleeting pleasures and bitter long-term disappointments. They seek inner fulfillment by obtaining positions of power in corporations and government, or even in their own families, by exercising excessive control. But deep inside, they are unfulfilled. I've had millionaire businessmen come to my office and tell me they have big houses, yachts, condominiums in Colorado, nice children, a beautiful mistress, an unsuspecting wife, secure corporate positions, and suicidal tendencies. They have everything this world has to offer except one thing: inner peace and joy. They came to my office as a last resort, begging me to help them conquer the urge to kill themselves. Why? The answers are not simple. The human mind and emotions are a very complex, dynamic system. I don't know Tiger Woods, but I watched his interview after he spoke to the press for the first time, and my heart really went out to him. Nobody wants to be just that shattered, especially in public. And one of them looked at him and said, which I thought was quite ironic coming from the media, they looked at him and said, how could you lie to so many for so long? I've had a question for some of them as well. How could you lie to so many for so long? Woods answered the only way he could have properly answered. He said, because I first lied to myself. I don't know him, but if I had a chance, I'd say, Tiger, what were you lying to yourself? What were you saying? It's possible he could have said, that I'd never get caught. But I would like to hear him say, I thought that's where my happiness lay, and it wasn't there. Stolen waters are not sweet. They have a bitter aftertaste. You must not jeopardize the sacred right of anyone else. And lastly, it is a beautiful little verse from Solomon himself, and he makes this simple comment: if you find honey, eat just enough too much of it and you will vomit. Well, not a very aesthetic sounding verse. If you find honey, eat just enough of it, too much of it, and you will vomit. What is he talking about? A balanced life. You must balance the spirit, the material, success, humility, power, surrender, family, public place, in the arena. You must have a balanced life. And as I bring this to a close, I have just two things with which to apply. Both of them have to do with relationships because of where Ayakoka left us, and then I close. It is this. An Olympic medalist phoned me one day from 2,000 miles away from Atlanta and said, I want to come and see you. I recognize the name. He flew in. Solidly built guy. Powerfully built. He said, do you know who I am? I said, yes, sir, I sure do. He said, can we go and have lunch? I had no idea why he'd come. Absolutely no idea. He started talking about the books and the radio program and all that were ministering to him. I was very encouraged by that. He said, do you know why I'm here? I said, no. He said, Ravi, from the time I was 12, my goal in life was to win the gold in the Olympics. I bought myself a camera. I filmed the world champion stride by stride by stride. And when the Olympics finally came for me to take part in my event, I was still a few seconds off the mark, and my coach never thought I was going to make it, but somehow I got selected. I started shattering all records in my heats, and all of a sudden, I was in the final. And millions of people were watching and cheering me on. I couldn't believe this moment had come. From the age of 12, my dream was about to come true, and the way I'd been performing in the heats, I was now being tipped to win the gold. He said, something happened just before the bullet was sounded. He said, for a fraction of a moment, I lost my concentration because I asked myself the question, I wonder if my father is watching. Because his dad always told him he was wasting his time, he was never going to succeed and never came for the Olympics. And the thought is my daddy watching. So the gun was sounded, I lost a stride. And I ended up with the bronze. I said, that's not too bad, is it? He said, no, sir, but I'd give it up for the love of my father. I'd give it up to be recognized by my dad. Switch gears. My grandson is 3 years old, Jude. He can talk a mile and a half. Somebody once said to Winston Churchill, I've never told you about my grandchildren, have I? He said, no, and I want you to know how much I appreciate it. But here's Jude. About 2 weeks ago, his mother was going through a rough time through the day, and he goes over to her, opens her palm, kisses her palm, and says, Mommy, I'm giving you my love. I'm giving you brave. Be brave. And she went through the day. He had to start going to school the next week, and he's crying his head off. He didn't want to go to school. So Naomi, my daughter, opens one palm, kisses it, and says, sweetheart, I'm giving you brave. And then she opened the other palm and said, and I'm giving you love. She said, Dad, when he got out from the car with his little backpack on his shoulder, he was clenching both of these fists and walking into the school, brave in one hand and love in the other. She said, I had to pull over on the side of the road and just cry my heart out. Ladies and gentlemen, have courage. Be strong when you're doing that which is right and walking. But understand there's somebody who really loves you. That's God, our Heavenly Father, who gave His Son to shed His blood for your redemption and mine. Matthew Paris, the atheistic writer from England, writing in the Times of London, wrote an article. I've got the whole article with me. It shocked the British readership. He said, I'm a confirmed atheist. Absolutely confirmed atheist. And you know, because that last line was so powerful, I think I want to read just that for you. Give me a moment. I'm sorry, I'm still a BlackBerry guy. And the reason is, I write. And I know that this will be a closing comment that I think will meet many of you in your situations. Here it is. And as he ends that article, he says this. He says, I'm shocked at what I'm saying as an atheist. Totally shocked. He said, but I want to say this. If Africa is going to run tall in this next century of ours, he said, it is not going to be the NGOs. It's not just going to be charity. It is going to take the gospel. He said, the change of heart is the only thing that is going to change this continent. And he goes into detail. He said, I'm stunned at myself saying what I am, but I've just returned from there. Talks the swagger of the big tribal system and so on. And he says how critical it is that the heart of humanity be changed. And he said, I know of no other way except the gospel of Jesus Christ that will change. And then he ends this in this brilliant paragraph. And I'm afraid the worldview there has to be supplanted by another. Removing Christian evangelism from the African equation may leave the continent at the mercy of a malign fusion of Nike, the witch doctor, the mobile phone, and the machete. I don't think it's just Africa, it's the whole world. Otherwise, it'll leave us with a malign fusion of extraordinary ability and unmitigated evil. The heart of humanity has to change. For that, I know only the gospel that can do that.
You've been watching Let My People Think with Dr. Ravi Zacharias. We're grateful for your prayers and financial support. If you'd like to know more about this ministry or would like to donate to our efforts, you can call us at 1-800-448-6766 or visit us online at www.rzim.org. You can also stay connected to RZIM through Twitter and Facebook. Our mailing address is RZIM, Post Office Box 921-939, Norcross, Georgia, 30010.
My honor to be with you here at Princeton. When I was in Germany.
India, very close to Bangladesh.
George Washington University.
The Middle East.
Meetings in Angola prison.
United States.
From China.
In Canada.
In the United Kingdom.
In Istanbul, in Ankara, and Izmir.
Romania.
At American University.
In the University of Harvard. Manila in the Philippines.
Perth, Australia.
To South Africa.
In Africa.
To Malaysia, to Indonesia, to Singapore. The mission of Ravi Zacharias International Ministries is really to reach the thinker and the skeptic, to answer the questions, and do evangelism undergirded by apologetics, in clearing all of the obstacles that stand in the way so that the questioner can take a direct look at the cross of Jesus Christ. We put it simply, it is to help the thinker to believe and the believer to think. In short, we are in their arena, bringing the gospel of Christ to help them traverse the longest journey in life, the journey from the head to the heart. The fivefold thrust of RZIM has always been first and foremost evangelism. We do evangelism undergirded by apologetics. Apologetics is not the main course, it is the seasoning. The gospel is the main message. So we do evangelism, we do it with apologetics, understanding the questions of people. We are involved in training people where they are and within the church, and training our young to be able to answer the questions that are being asked of them. And then spiritual disciplines, because we never want to forget the heart that has to be touched and reached. So we've got evangelism, apologetics, training, and spiritual disciplines. But there is a fifth very important component. And to switch metaphors for just a moment, it was Francis Schaeffer who said evangelism has to walk on 2 feet. Evangelism is the proclamation, compassion and mercy ministries is the other foot with which you walk into arenas. So Wellspring International is the humanitarian arm of RZIM, which is apologetics with a touch. These 5 components of evangelism, apologetics, training, spiritual disciplines, and the humanitarian need. These are the issues that really carry us into various settings. RZIM historically has focused on 4 major groups: the academic, the business, the political, and the arts, because we believe these 4 arenas really shape the ethos and the values of a culture. Now, obviously, we get into many other groups. We do a lot of work in churches or groups and gatherings where people want to discuss such issues. But we think clearly that when you're in the academic arena or the business arena or the political arena or the arts, these ones so overtly affect culture that we want to be in those settings. You know, very recently I was being interviewed by a major magazine, and he said something that really, really encouraged me. He said, you know, when I think of your team and I think of the approach you all take, he said, your focus is on two major methods. Number one, you focus on the beauty of the gospel and you respect the listener and the questioner. I said to him, you could not have encouraged my heart more in any question than just that, because that's what we really try to do as a team. You know, the Bible says to worship the Lord in the beauty of holiness. The gospel is a beautiful story. It's a story not just told as fact, but it is told in the attractiveness of who Jesus Christ is and what his forgiveness and grace and transforming power mean. But you can never proclaim that without respecting the honest questioner and listening to them carefully. Have you noticed how Jesus engaged the woman at the well, for example, listening to her so carefully and systematically taking away those barriers that she had raised? And Peter reminds us to set apart Christ in our hearts as Lord and to always be prepared to give a reason, an apologia, an apologetic for the hope that is within you, and to do that with gentleness and respect. So we retain the dignity of the listener and never compromise on the nobility of the gospel. The barriers to belief are many, and they're actually increasing in intensity in our time. The intellectual barriers, think for example of the overt hostility of some of the most strident anti-theists of our time. Naturalism has become sort of the buzzword of interpreting everything from a single scientific vision. This is a challenge our universities face. They seem to be imparted to again and again that the naturalistic worldview, the scientific worldview has displaced the possibility of the miraculous. All spiritual talk is nothing but tooth fairy talk, according to Richard Dawkins. And so that barrier is very real. We cannot treat it as something minor. If a student is bombarded day in and day out with that framework and that paradigm, how then on a Sunday morning do they sit in church and want to listen to a story from the Gospels to be told as historic truth? So there's the intellectual barrier. There is the barrier of cultural values. So much is in transit. So much is changing that often anyone who claims exclusivity in truth is seen as prejudiced and marginalizing people in groups and so on. Those are issues that have to be engaged with. So there's the intellectual challenge, there's the ethical challenge, there are cultural challenges, there are breakdowns, or there's a breakdown of convictions once held. All of these stand as a block between the listener and the proclaimer. And let me add one more thing. If we don't reach our young generation now, we'll be in a recovery mode for years and years to come. We were warned in the 70s and 80s by people like Francis Schaeffer, Malcolm Muggeridge, and others as to what was looming. The church did not take those warnings seriously, and we can see what exactly has happened. So we have to wrestle with the issues that keep people from putting their trust in the gospel narrative. The global reach is critical because the cross-cultural pollination that is going on. You know, they used to say the East is the East and the West is the West and the twain shall never meet. Couldn't be farther from the truth right now. I mean, on a given morning, you can have breakfast in New York and then end up having dinner in London. And you can have breakfast the next day in Delhi and on to Bangkok and Singapore. And I think somebody once told me that within 3 to 4 hours flight of Singapore, you can reach about 50% of the world's youth. You look at the high percentage of 40 to 50% in their teens and 20s and between India and China alone. An incredible wealth of youth that the world is now boasting that we need to reach. A global perspective is not only that for commercial purposes. You know, go into malls and you see all the same brands and same gently, but basically, in his own words, it's a load of bunk. He said, this nonsense that religious belief conveys to us ought to be cast aside. And he said, our students need to realize that science is now dominating the landscape. And science will finally find the answer to everything, including our moral reasoning and our capacities to think in those categories, why they even come about. We don't need God to postulate that. I remember in my younger days, college, reading the words, "Thou hast conquered, thou pale Galilean. The world has grown gray under thy breath. Thou hast conquered, thou pale Galilean. The world has grown gray under thy breath." It was Charles Algernon Swinburne. I never knew that he actually did not coin that phrase. Until years later, I was wondering why he had even said that, because he was a mid-19th century poet. His words actually hark back to the last words of the last pagan emperor Julian, who on his deathbed uttered the words, "the pale Galilean," because he could see the encroachment of a new worldview and the displacement of the pagan beliefs of Rome, and Rome was going to be conquered as a result. And he reminded his people that the conquering Galilean had really reached his hands over into the Roman Empire. But this struggle for Rome was not just isolated. Cultures struggle with it. Nations struggle with it. You remember the words of William Blake? "And did those feet in ancient times walk upon England's mountain green? And was the holy Lamb of God on England's pleasant pasture seen? Bring me my bow of burning gold, bring me my arrows of desire. Bring me my spears, O clouds unfold, bring me my chariot of fire. I shall not cease from mental flight, nor shall my sword sleep in my hand, till we have built Jerusalem on England's green and pasture land." It is also Blake who went on to castigate the rest of Europe when he said, mock on, Voltaire, Rousseau, mock on till all is all in vain. You throw the sand into the wind, and the wind blows it back again." And it was Blake who, in the same place where he uttered the words of Jerusalem, went on, "Milton, thou shouldest be living in this hour. England has need of thee." Nations have wanted to have their souls somehow rendered sacred. And so we sing, "God bless America, land that I love. Stand beside her and guide her through the night with a light from above." And so we sing, "God keep our land glorious and free. O Canada, we stand on guard for thee." And so we sing, "God save our gracious Queen. Long live our noble Queen." The Western world has oftentimes sought that divine encounter and that divine preservation. But I remember well also growing up as a little boy in Delhi and being raised in India. And now when you look at the words of the national anthem there, they invoke the words of Yamuna and Ganga, the two sacred rivers in the Hindu mindset. Even they somehow, in a pantheistic worldview, want to find something transcendent, something holy that they could ultimately latch on to. The battle as it continues rages not only in the soul of a culture, but these voices come within you as you go back and forth and struggle within your own mind to arrive at a point of reference and at a point of continuation for your own life. Robert Jastrow, the famed scientist who died in 2008, was a PhD in theoretical physics from Columbia. He was the first chairman of NASA's lunar exploration, chief of theoretical division of NASA from 1958 to 1961, founding director of NASA's Goddard Institute of Space, professor of geophysics in Columbia, professor of earth sciences at Dartmouth, 1981 to 1982. Did you hear the credentials of that man? Listen to what he said. And by the way, he worked very closely with the probably the greatest rocket scientist of his time, Wernher von Braun. And it was Wernher von Braun who was once upon a time with the Nazi regime, building their rockets for world domination, came through a tremendous conversion experience, came to know Christ, and became one of the most decorated scientists here in America. Von Braun and Jastrow worked together. Listen to what Jastrow says. We see how the astronomical evidence supports the biblical view of the origin of the world. The essential elements in the astronomical and biblical accounts of Genesis are basically the same. Science has proved that the universe exploded into being at a certain moment. It asks, what cause produced this effect? Who or what put the matter or energy into the universe? And science cannot answer that question. This is an astrophysicist. This man who understands science, who's pleading with scientists not to play God. And by the way, Jastrow was a skeptic. Wernher von Braun was a believer. But listen to how Jastrow went on to say this. There is a strange ring of feeling and emotion in scientists on such matters. They come from the heart. You would expect their judgments to really come from the brain. Why? I think part of their answer is that scientists cannot bear the thought of a natural phenomenon which cannot be explained naturally, even with unlimited time and money given to them. There is a kind of religion in science. It is the religion of a person who believes there is order and harmony in the universe and that every effect must have its cause. But this religious faith of the naturalist and the scientist is violated by the discovery that the world had a beginning under conditions in which the known laws of physics are invalid. And as a product of forces or circumstances we cannot discover. When that happens, the scientist has lost control, and that's what he doesn't like. Here's what he ends up saying. For the scientist who has lived by his faith in the power of reason, the story ends up like a bad dream. He has scaled the mountains of ignorance. He's about to conquer the highest peak. And as he pulls himself over the final rock, he's greeted by a band of theologians who've been sitting there for centuries. So the poets go toe-to-toe. The scientists go toe-to-toe. And I bring this down to your life and mine and try to find an answer tonight. Bernard Shaw in his Androcles and the Lion says this. Bernard Shaw, mid-19th century as well. Consequently, if it were mentally possible for all of us to believe in the atonement, we should have to cry off it, as we evidently have a right to do to every man to whom salvation is offered. He has an inalienable natural right to say to God, no thank you. I prefer to retain my full moral responsibility. It is not good for me to be able to load a scapegoat with my sins. I should be less careful how I committed them if I knew they would cost me nothing. But then later on he goes to say this. This man has not been a failure yet, for nobody has ever been sane enough to try his way. But this man has had one quaint triumph. We have always had a curious feeling inside us that though we crucified Christ on a stick, he somehow managed to get hold of the right end of that stick, and if that we were better men, we might try his way. We have this curious feeling that he held on to the right end of the stick, and that if we were better men, we might try his way. When you take a conflict like this that goes across the ages, sooner or later it comes into your living room, and your sons and daughters are thinking of the choice between, thou hast conquered, thou pale Galilean, the world has grown gray under thy breath, or the Blakean vision, mock on, Voltaire, Rousseau, 'tis all in vain. You throw the sand into the wind and the wind blows it back again. You see, nobody told those 33 miners when they came out of that mine to say that 133 of us. Nobody told them Hawking didn't believe God existed. But they came out of that mine, and after all of the genius of science and boring through that concrete, one guy falls on his knees and lifts his countenance towards the heavens, and another one turns and says, there weren't 33 of us, there were 34. God walked in his presence around that mine for these 70 days with us. If you're hemmed in life, Rousseau and Voltaire and Bernard Shaw's diatribe won't help you. Somehow you clutch, and then you emerge and scale the mountaintops and grab that last rock, and you see a theologian has been sitting there for centuries. Now, what I want to do tonight is answer this question, not just if God, but why Christ? Why is it this Jesus? Because you can go through arguments for the existence of God, but why is this Jesus the one that we are really looking for? Why is it you and I are here? I want to take you through 3 layers of answers, because Jesus is explaining this himself. The place is packed to capacity, so much so that his 4 brothers and his mother cannot get in to hear him. They are crowded out. I want you to picture that scene. They want to hear what he's talking about there. And he's being questioned by the Pharisees, and one of the Pharisees is saying to him, do you know your disciples, these guys are violating the Sabbath. They were walking through the grain fields and they ate on the Sabbath. And Jesus looked at them and he said this, do you not remember what happened to David and his companions when they actually walked into the home of the temple and they ate the most sacred bread of all? Do you remember that? And he says, as a matter of fact, do you boys know when you go to worship on the Sabbath, the priests are actually working on that day? Are they violating the Sabbath? And then he gives them these words, a greater than the temple is in the midst of you. You see, religion will always engender its laws and its ceremonies. Always. Laws and ceremonies will haunt you, till guilt becomes the cornerstone of all belief if you either violated that law or didn't bring the appropriate ceremony. If you remember what the temple was like, remember what Micah said, with what shall I come before the Lord and bow down before the exalted God? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old, with thousands of rams and thousands of rivers of oil? Shall I offer my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? He has shown you, O man, what is good, to act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly before your God. You walk into a temple and all you see is garishness, goriness, ways to come into the presence of God, to a point where even child sacrifice became a norm. If you go to Penang, Malaysia, or to parts of Malaysia or Singapore, and you see the festival of Thaipusam, and you'll see rivers of milk flowing during Thaipusam, gallon after gallon after gallon poured into these gutters as the idols are being bathed in this milk, and self-immolation has taken place. Knives going from one side of the face to the other, or through the lips, or through the tongue, and for hour after hour they'll walk with this cavity that pierces into their flesh. And you arrive at the temple. I've seen it with my own eyes. Bob and I were there in Penang and watching these gutters flowing with milk. With what shall I come before you? Has he not shown you, O man, what is good, to do justice, love mercy, and to walk humbly before your God? But here's what I want to drive home. Very important. I want you to follow me. Jesus' 4 brothers are outside. His mother is standing there. They can't get in. And they want to hear what he has to say. And he's actually told, your family is outside there. He gave a rather blunt answer at that moment. But it was his brother Jude who wrote one of the shortest books in the Bible, who said this. He said, beware what this religion will do to you He said, beware of the way of Cain. Beware of the way of Balaam. Beware of the way of Korah. Now here's how Jude introduced himself: as the servant of Jesus Christ and a brother of James. I wonder if he was tempted to say a brother of Jesus and a servant of James, because James was the head of the church. He said, no, I'm a servant of Jesus Christ and the brother of James. And he goes on, now unto him who is able to keep you from falling and to present you faultless before the eternal white throne, and so on. To him be glory and majesty, power. He understood the glory of Christ, having watched him under the same roof. And so James and Jude became followers of the message of Christ. And Jude warns us of three temptations in religion: the way of Cain, jealousy. Think of how the church has failed because of power struggles. How much jealousy comes. Nobody wanting the other person to become the greatest preacher or the greatest writer or the greatest singer or the greatest giver. And so blood was shed in the garden when Cain despised the fact that his brother's sacrifice was accepted more than his. Jealousy that has made such a deep dent in the history of the church, where we have not shown the grace of accepting one greater than ourselves. Or the way of Balaam, which is greed, prevarication, manipulation of people. I don't know if I'm right here,